Daniel was zipping his suitcase shut when his sister walked in without knocking and called him a monster. "Mom has cancer, Daniel, stage 3, and you're going to Cabo." He didn't look up. He pressed his knee against the bulging suitcase, forced the zipper the last 6 inches, and said, "It's already booked, Rachel." "Unbook it." "I can't." "You can't, or you won't." He finally looked at her. Rachel stood in the doorway of his childhood bedroom, the one their mother had never redecorated, still with the faded blue curtains and the corkboard covered in ticket stubs from a life he barely remembered living, and her eyes were red-rimmed and furious. She had their mother's eyes. Sharp, dark, quick to well up but slow to actually cry. "I have a flight at 6, he said. "Mom asked for you at the hospital yesterday. She asked where you were. I told her you were coming. I lied to her, Daniel, because I couldn't believe my own brother would rather lie on a beach than sit with her while she..." Rachel's voice cracked and she hated herself for it, hated that he got to see it crack, while she's scared out of her mind. "I know. You know, that's it. That's your whole response." Daniel hoisted the suitcase off the bed. It was heavier than it looked, and he grunted a little, and Rachel took petty satisfaction in the fact that at least something was hard for him today. "I have to go," he said. "I'll call you when I land." "Don't bother." Rachel stepped aside so he could pass, because some childish part of her still wouldn't physically block a doorway even now, even furious. "Have a great trip. Send a postcard. I'm sure Mom will love hearing about the piña coladas from her hospital bed." He walked past her down the stairs, past the kitchen where their father sat with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug he wasn't drinking from, staring at nothing. Their father didn't say anything either. He just watched Daniel go, the way you watch whether you can't control. At the door, Daniel paused. "Tell Mom I love her," he said. Rachel, who had followed him down, let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Tell her yourself. Oh wait, you won't be here." He didn't answer that. He opened the door, stepped into the grey Tuesday afternoon, and was gone. Rachel spent the next 13 days constructing an increasingly detailed case against her brother, presenting it to anyone who would listen: their Aunt Carol, her own husband Mike, the hospital chaplain who really just wanted to ask about visiting hours. Daniel had always been the golden child who slid out of responsibility. Daniel had missed their father's 60th birthday for a work thing that turned out to be a hiking trip. Daniel had sent a fruit basket instead of showing up when Rachel had her first baby. Daniel, a name that had become, in the family lexicon, shorthand for absence. Their mother Elaine said nothing about it. She underwent her first round of chemo on a Thursday, vomited quietly into a pink plastic basin, and when Rachel apologized on Daniel's behalf, Elaine just shook her head and said, "He'll come when he comes." "Moms, you don't have to defend him." "I'm not defending him." Elaine's voice was thin, stripped down by the treatment, but there was something steady underneath it, something Rachel didn't have the energy to examine. "I just know my son." Rachel took that as denial. Grief does strange things to people, she told herself. Her mother was protecting herself from the pain of Daniel's absence by refusing to feel it. That was easier to believe than the alternative, that her mother knew something Rachel didn't. Instagram did not help Rachel's case against her brother, or rather, it helped it enormously until it didn't. For the first 4 days, Daniel posted nothing, which Rachel found suspicious, probably too busy day drinking to document it, she decided. Then on day 5, a single photo appeared. An unfamiliar building, white and clinical palm trees along the driveway, no caption. Rachel screenshotted it and sent it to her husband with 3 words: "Vacation, my ass." She assumed it was a resort, some boutique wellness spa with an aesthetic she didn't recognize. She did not zoom in on the small sign near the entrance. If she had, she might have seen, in blue lettering too small to read on a phone screen, the words Instituto de Trasplantes. Here is what Rachel did not know, what almost no one knew, because Daniel had specifically, deliberately, at real cost to his own reputation within the family, made sure no one knew. 3 weeks before that fight in his childhood bedroom, Daniel had gotten a call from Dr. Whitfield, his mother's oncologist, that he had not shared with anyone. Elaine's cancer, an aggressive form of acute myeloid leukemia discovered almost by accident during a pre-surgical bloodwork panel, had a treatment pathway beyond conventional chemo, a stem cell transplant, but it required a match. A close match, the kind siblings sometimes had and children more rarely did, the kind that required testing, and even then, only succeeded about a quarter of the time within a family. Rachel had been tested first, not a match. Their father, obviously, was ruled out on genetic grounds before they even bothered. Daniel was the last possibility, and when the lab results came back, the coordinator at the transplant center called him directly, because he'd asked them to. He did not want his family to know he was being tested, because he did not want to hand them false hope, and he especially did not want his mother to know, because Elaine was the kind of woman who would refuse a transplant from her own son out of guilt if she thought it endangered him even slightly. He was a match, not perfect, a 9 out of 10 on the antigen panel, good enough to proceed, not good enough to be simple. Here is the second thing nobody knew. The standard donation process, where they simply draw stem cells from your bloodstream after a course of injections, wasn't viable for Daniel. His cell counts, for reasons the specialists explained to him in language he'd had to ask them to repeat twice, made him a poor candidate for the peripheral collection method. He needed a bone marrow harvest instead, a more invasive procedure done under general anesthesia, needles inserted directly into the pelvic bone to draw marrow out in small, repeated extractions. Painful recovery. Real risk, small but real under anesthesia. And the specialists who did this particular high-risk extraction procedure for imperfect match donors, the ones with the outcomes data Daniel, had researched obsessively for 11 nights in a row, practiced at exactly 2 centers in the world that would take his case on the timeline his mother's diagnosis demanded. One was in Boston. The other was the white building with palm trees outside Guadalajara, where a doctor named Ruz had pioneered a marrow harvest protocol with a documented complication rate less than half the American average, because his team did nothing else, ran nothing but this procedure, week after week, for donors just like Daniel. Daniel had called Boston first. The wait list, given his window, was 11 weeks. His mother did not have 11 weeks to spare before her transplant needed to happen. Dr. Ruz could take him in 9 days. He booked the flight the same afternoon. He did not tell his family because the moment he told them, it would become a story about hope. And if something went wrong, if his marrow wasn't sufficient, if the harvest failed, if any of the dozen things that could derail a transplant did, he did not want his mother spending her last strong weeks grieving a possibility instead of living inside whatever time she had. He wanted to hand her a fact, not a maybe. He would rather be hated as a coward for 2 weeks than be loved as a hero, chasing something that might not work. So he let Rachel call him a monster. He let his father watch him leave without a word. He got on a plane to Guadalajara and checked into a hotel across the street from a clinic that specialized in exactly one impossible, hopeful, terrifying thing. And he did not post about any of it, except one photograph on day 5, because his hands were shaking too badly that morning to write a caption, and he needed to feel like he'd told somebody, even if nobody understood what they were looking at. The procedure itself took 90 minutes. Daniel remembered almost none of it. General anesthesia does that on purpose, but he remembered waking up in a recovery room with a nurse named Sophia checking his blood pressure, and the ache in his hips that felt, he'd later tell people, like he'd been kicked by 2 horses simultaneously, and then asked to sit in a hard plastic chair for a week. He couldn't walk properly for 4 days. He lay in a hotel bed with a heating pad and a bag of frozen peas doubling as ice, watching Mexican soap operas he couldn't understand, texting no one, because there was no one to text who knew where he was or why. On day 9, still limping, he flew home with a small refrigerated case checked as medical cargo, his own marrow, harvested, processed, and cleared for transport, racing the clock on a 48-hour viability window back to the hospital where his mother was waiting for a transplant nobody had told her was coming from her own son. He landed at 6 in the evening. He had told the transplant coordinator he would meet the courier team at the hospital. He had not told his family anything. He walked into the hospital lobby still moving like an old man, jaw clenched against the ache, carrying nothing himself. The medical courier had the case, was already moving briskly toward the elevator with a hospital escort. And the first person he saw was Rachel, coming out of the cafeteria with 2 coffees, one for herself and one, out of old habit, for a brother she'd been furious at for 2 weeks. She stopped dead when she saw him. She looked at the coffee in her hand like she'd forgotten she was holding it. You're actually here. I said I'd come. You said a lot of things, but there was no heat in it now, just confusion because he looked wrong. Sunburn nowhere, pale actually and thinner and walking with a strange careful gait like his hips didn't work right, and there was a hospital bracelet on his wrist that was not this hospital's bracelet, printed with words she didn't recognize in Spanish. Daniel, what is that? He looked down at his wrist like he'd forgotten it was there. It's nothing. It says hospital. Daniel, were you at a hospital? Before he could answer, the elevator dinged, and the medical courier, a young man in scrubs with the small refrigerated case now handed off to a hospital transport tech, wheeled past them toward the transplant unit, and the tech said without thinking to the nurse walking alongside, "Donors here too, apparently just landed." Rachel's coffee hit the floor. Donor, she repeated. Donor for what? Daniel exhaled, 13 days of silence, and it all came apart in a hospital lobby with spilled coffee soaking into his shoes. I'm a match, he said, for Mom, 9 out of 10. I've spent the last 9 days at a transplant clinic in Guadalajara, having my bone marrow harvested, because it was the only place that could take me in time. Because Boston had an 11-week wait and Mom doesn't have 11 weeks. And I didn't tell you, I didn't tell anyone. Because if I'd told you and then something had gone wrong, if the harvest had failed or my marrow wasn't good enough or the transplant doesn't take. I didn't want Mom's last good week spent hopping for something that might not happen. I wanted to give her a fact, not a maybe. His voice was shaking now, all the control finally giving out. So I let you think I was on vacation. I let you hate me for 2 weeks because that felt like a smaller thing to survive than watching Mom hope and then lose that hope if it didn't work. I'm sorry. I'm not sorry I did it. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you. Rachel stood frozen, coffee pooling around her shoes, staring at her brother, sunburned nowhere, 10 pounds lighter, wincing every time he shifted his weight, a foreign hospital bracelet on his wrist and an ache in his eyes that had nothing to do with jet lag. You let me call you a monster, she whispered. For 2 weeks, you let Dad look at you like. She stopped, pressed her hand over her mouth. Daniel. I know. You could have just told me. I would have kept it a secret. I would have. Would you? His voice wasn't cruel, just tired. You cried in front of Mom twice in 1 week over things that weren't even that bad. You've never once been able to hide anything from her, not since we were kids. If I'd told you, she would have known inside 48 hours, and then she'd have spent her last 3 weeks before transplant either hopping for a miracle or worse, trying to talk me out of it because she'd feel guilty about the risk to me. I couldn't give her that. I could only give her a solved problem. Rachel was crying now properly, not the controlled almost tears from before, but something messier, both hands over her face, and when she finally lowered them, she said, in a voice scraped raw, I told the chaplain you were a monster. I told Aunt Carol you probably weren't even thinking about her at all this whole time. I was thinking about her every hour, Daniel said quietly. I just couldn't say so. They let Daniel see his mother before the transplant, wheelchair-bound by hospital protocol because of his own recovery, hips still aching, a nurse pushing him down the hallway to Eleanor's room. Rachel walked alongside, silent, wrecked. Glancing at her brother every few seconds like she was trying to reconcile 2 completely different people into one. Elaine was sitting up in bed when they came in, thinner than 2 weeks ago, a cannula under her nose, and when she saw Daniel her whole face changed, not surprise, Rachel noticed. Not surprise at all. Something closer to relief, and underneath the relief, something that looked almost like she'd been waiting. There you are, Elaine said. Mom, Daniel's voice broke on the single syllable. I know, Elaine said before he could get any further. Dr. Whitfield told me 3 weeks ago you were being tested. I made her promise not to tell your sister. I didn't want anyone hopping too hard before we knew for sure. She reached out one thin hand and Daniel took it, and Rachel, standing in the doorway, watching 2 people who had apparently been keeping the exact same secret from her at the exact same time, let out a sound that was half sob, half incredulous laugh. You knew, Rachel said. You knew, and you let me spend 2 weeks calling him a monster. I didn't know for certain he'd go through with it, Elaine said, still holding her son's hand. I only knew my son, and I knew that if he disappeared without a word right when I got sick, it wasn't because he didn't love me. It was because he loved me too much to let me watch him take a risk on my behalf without a guarantee at the end of it. She looked at Daniel, and her eyes finally, after weeks of holding steady through needles and nausea and fear, filled with tears. You beautiful, stubborn, secretive idiot, she said. You could have just told me. I couldn't, Daniel said. I'm sorry, Mom, I couldn't watch you say no. I would have said yes, Elaine whispered. I would have said yes in a heartbeat because that's what a mother does, but I understand why you didn't give me the choice. You wanted to protect me from hopping. I know exactly where you get that from. Rachel, still in the doorway, finally understood what her mother had meant days ago in the chemo ward. He'll come when he comes. I just know my son. Not denial, not a mother refusing to feel abandoned. A mother who had trusted, all along, in a version of her son that Rachel had stopped believing in years ago, back when Daniel first started missing birthdays and sending fruit baskets instead of showing up, a version who was still there underneath the absence, just harder to see, working quietly on things nobody had asked him to do. I'm sorry, Rachel said to him now, crossing the room, kneeling by the wheelchair, careful of his hips. I'm so sorry, I should have trusted you. You didn't know what I knew, Daniel said. That's not your fault, I made sure of that. Still, I called you a monster on Instagram. A wet, disbelieving laugh escaped her, in the comments of Aunt Carol's post, publicly. I saw the notification from the plane, Daniel admitted. It strung a little. I'll delete it. Leave it, Elaine said, and when they both looked at her surprised, she managed a small, exhausted smile. Let it stay up. Someday you'll both look back at it and remember that love doesn't always look like what you expect it to. Sometimes it looks like a closed suitcase and a lie about a beach. Sometimes it's the ugliest looking thing in the room, right up until you find out what it actually was. The transplant took place 2 days later. It was, in the plain clinical language of Dr. Whitfield's follow-up notes, uncomplicated. Elaine's body accepted her son's marrow within the expected window, and 6 weeks after that, her blood counts began the slow climb that would eventually be called, in another 6 months, remission. Daniel kept the hospital bracelet from Guadalajara. He never explained to anyone outside the family what those 2 weeks had actually cost him, physically or otherwise. The ache in his hips lasted nearly 2 months, longer than the doctors had estimated, but he didn't need anyone else to understand it. He only needed the 3 people in that hospital room to know eventually what the vacation had really been. Rachel took down the Instagram comment after all, 3 days later, but she kept the photo Daniel had posted, the white building, the palm trees, the sign too small to read, and pinned it to the top of her own profile, with a caption she wrote and rewrote a dozen times before finally settling on something simple. Sometimes the people who seem like they're running away are the ones running toward you the whole time. Love you, little brother.